This is crash course, Chinese style.
Hey there, we're going to talk about China today, where the ninjas are from. Quang ching ching pang pang pong, quang quang pang ping pong ping pong.
Swang twang tong wong.
A shang twang twang.
Quang kong.
Quang quang quang.
Quang kong.
Okay, kill. Just kidding. Ninjas aren't from China. But today we're going to talk about 5 key factors that happened in China from 1750 to 1950. The Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, the Nationalist Party forming, the Qin Dynasty falling, and Mao Zedong. Now off to Ashley to talk about the Opium Wars.
Hey, it's Ashley here. We're going to talk about the Opium Wars now. The first one started in 1839 because the Chinese didn't want the opium trading with the British anymore. The British didn't like this because their only source of money was from the opium trading because the silk and cotton trade didn't give them enough money. Lin Zhu, he didn't like this idea, and so he took control and banned the sale of opium in China. He also took away any British rights in China. He also made the opium be given to the Chinese authorities, and there were no opium trade bonds anywhere in China or with the British. He also closed the channel to Canton, not allowing the British ships to come into the ports. Then Charles Eliot said that he would give the British money if they would just hand over their opium and stop the trading. But the British didn't like this idea because they said it wouldn't work and it was not what they wanted to do. They wanted to keep trading. So Thomas Coates tried to sail into Gangenberg, but Eliot had blocked the Pearl River. So the ships were not able to get in. There was a second ship that tried to come in on November 3rd, and this is when the first shots were fired of the battle, and the British ended up winning because they outnumbered the Chinese. In 1840, the governor ordered no help to any British in China, and that the Chinese people couldn't have contact with the British. Lord Palmerston, he initiated the next war because he was English. He was an English secretary person, same thing. And it doesn't really matter what he was, but the Chinese had to open 5 ports because of his initiation of war, and then the British retaliated, and this was because America and England were not happy with what they were doing supporting the drug trade. So they attacked Guangdong again, and they had 4,000 Marines and a bunch of ships, and they obviously won that again because China was not strong enough. And then in 1841 they captured the Bogue forts and defeated Chinese at Ningbo and Changhao. And then China signed the first unequal treaty of Nanjing in 1842. And China signed their first unequal treaty, which allowed British to have open trade with China's harbors. Then this led to the Second Opium War, which was caused because the British and French burned down Beijing, and then in 1860 the Beijing Treaty was signed, and this allowed free trade, mission, and travel all through China, and which led to China's decreasing power and British taking over. And then the ending China's humiliation led to the Manchu dynasty falling and the Boxer Rebellion in the 1900s.
Now off to AJ to talk about the Boxer Rebellion.
The Boxer Rebellion makes me think of a time when
Oh, I think that was good.
that's actually not what happened, but the Boxer Rebellion is actually when the people of China rose up to get rid of all foreign invaders, you could say, that were in China. So that's like people from Europe, Japanese, like missionaries and everything. And what happened was it started in the north from peasants, and then their original purpose was to stop the Qing dynasty, first of all, and then second, get rid of all the foreign people. But eventually the emperor made a deal with them so then they wouldn't overthrow the government because he wanted to stay in power, of course. And then eventually though, united forces from like Europe and Japan, they all wanted to stay in China, so they got together with soldiers to stop it. And so they went to Peking, which is now Beijing, which is the capital at the time, and they ended the Boxer Revolution. Basically, they took over the city, and then that left the Boxer.
Now off to Hannah to talk about the Nationalist Party.
So the Chinese Nationalist Party was founded in 1912 by Sun Yat-sen, and its first main idea, or kind of like thing they wanted to do, was to take over the Qin dynasty, which was in power at that time. And after the Boxer Revolution, the Qin dynasty was weakened from that. So the Chinese Nationalist Party wanted to overthrow them, but it didn't work, and they were unsuccessful, so they became a part of the monarchy. And then Sun Yat-sen realized that he needed to organize and tighten the Chinese Nationalist Party. So it became a secret society, and they would have discussions about how to do this and still how to overthrow the monarchy. And so they received guidance from the Bolsheviks and other Chinese communists and the Soviets. And they became successful, and they did throw over the Qin dynasty, and that is when they owed their success to the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, and the Chinese communists. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen died, and Chiang Kai-shek was his successor, and he was responsible for bringing most of China under control by ending and limiting regional warlord autonomy. Basically a dictatorship. And then Chiang Kai-shek had three principles of the people. The first one was nationalism, the second one was democracy, and the third one was people's livelihood. Nationalism was, it meant that there was equality with all other countries, and even though China had resisted when Japan tried to come in and take them over, but they weren't resistant to when the Russian communists came in and tried to like show them their ways. And then democracy, it didn't really have a good part in China. They had a couple constitutions and neither of them worked. And then people's livelihood, which the purpose of it was to eliminate corruption in China, but it didn't work. It wasn't successful. And it didn't work because there was weakness in leadership, and the people didn't want to change from the feudal social structure that had been around for a really long time. In 1945, China defeated Japan, and the Chinese communists that were left in China, they stayed there while the Chinese Nationalist Party went out and captured Taiwan. And there were about 2 million people that went to Taiwan, and after they left, they stayed in Taiwan most of the time, and then the Chinese communists took over, and that was it. Now the Chinese Nationalist Party only exists in Taiwan.
Now to Julia to talk about the Qing dynasty.
The Qing dynasty ended due to two main reasons. The first one was because of outside forces coming in and trying to take over. The British tried to take control along the coast with imperialism, and the Russians tried to take over the border of Russia and China. Japan also tries to get power because once they figured out how to build a strong military, they came in and tried to take over different parts of China. And all three of the different outside forces coming in really like stirred up things in China and it made people disagree and like jumbled everybody up and caused a lot of the internal conflicts. And the peasants and the lower class people weren't happy with how like the Qing Dynasty rulers were running. So the peasants try to rebel against the rulers and it doesn't really work. And so then the armies of the Qing Dynasty get mad and they join up with the army or with the peasants, and then they like take over, and the ruling of the king leaders was really bad, so then they overthrow them. And at the same time, the Communist Party is kind of like starting to rise, and they take over. And now to Seth to talk about Mao.
Seth here. We're going to talk about Mao and the Communist Party. So after what Julia talked about, what happens is, in 1949, the Communist Party rises to power, and Mao Zedong is the leader and the chairman. Basically, he had a lot of policies that were a little controversial, but most of them were positive, like the Anti-Campaign Acts and the 5-year plan. The Anti-Campaign Acts were used to strike fear into the Chinese nation by targeting wealthy capitalists, and as you can probably tell, communists aren't too fond of capitalists. So, we keep going in, and people are getting more and more scared. It became so bad that people wouldn't even walk below skyscrapers in Beijing because of fear of people committing suicide and landing on them. It's pretty gruesome. So, as we get going, after the Anti-Campaign Acts, China's kind of scared now. People are dying, not a good time. Let me go into the next 5-year plan. After the anti-campaigns, Mao's next step was the 5-year campaign. This basically was a move away from agriculture into making China an industrial power. What it did really was make China a superpower, much like the Soviet Union. So anyway, that was the success, making China very powerful and maybe even more profitable than the Soviet Union. But the next 5-year plan, also called the Great Leap Forward, turned out to be a major disaster because Mao made such a shift away from agriculture that nearly 30 million people died of famine. It's not good. Now for a break for the Chinese national sport, ping pong. Score! Seth again, just got back from playing in the snow. Anyway, after the Great Leap Forward, Mao continued to have very controversial policies such as the Cultural Revolution, which was a way to unseat the new class of power that he feared would unsettle the communist ideologies in China. Anyways, on top of these 4 main policies that he enacted, he also had several land reforms that would strip the land away from landowners and distribute it back to the peasants, which is a very communist ideology, as well as millions of executions that happened over his time in power, making him a questionable dictator. Seth and Hannah here.
We're doing changes and continuities. A change was that when communism came in after the Chinese Nationalist Party, it challenged Confucian ideas, which had been around for a while.
Another change would be that women were made much more equal in the new communist society, as well as the government taking control and owning almost everything.
Yeah, it was pretty much a dictatorship.
Mao was a bad guy. He's mean. A few continuities throughout this time period would be that the isolationism foreign policy for China continued, which it had been for the last several hundred years. And another continuity would be that between the shift from the nationalists and the communists in power it continued to be the same structure of government between that time period.